As I was looking through this passage, this gospel passage, I realized first that parables can create a whole flood of images and emotions that cross through each one of our individual lives, oftentimes in different perspectives. But we need to enter into these stories, these parables, with our own perspective. And oftentimes, that can be both good and bad. It's important, as I was really struggling reading through these different readings to try and figure out a solid message to bring forward, I came upon the fact that it was important to note the very beginning, the simile that Jesus says in the first verse. The kingdom of heaven is like. We're no longer talking about earthly things, we're talking about the kingdom. And while our readings are not necessarily thematically connected, it seemed as I read over and struggled with these passages over the course of this past week, I started to see some spaces where they may actually fit together. And as I looked at this gospel message, I was first tempted to think about the justice and injustice of wages as a starting point. But I realized that this is a gospel about the kingdom of heaven, and that there were some connections to the old and new that gave me some insight. First, I realized that in the Old Testament and the gospel, that both agreed to the situation they were in. The Israelites, by right, wanted to get out of Egypt. They were enslaved. They were being taken advantage of, and they were ready to go. In the case of the gospel, there were workers in the marketplace, and they needed work in order to survive. I also found that both of them, at some point in the course of the passages, had what I would think of as kind of a memory lapse. They kind of forgot, in both situations, the choice they had made. And that led to, understandably, a little bit of grumbling on both cases. It was also interesting, and this is a small part, but it tied together for me, and it was the fact that both of them start by grumbling at the manager, as it were, the paymaster in the gospel, and Moses and Aaron in the Old Testament. And they were both directed to what we see as the owner in God. That, as Moses and Aaron pointed out, your issue is not with me, but with God. And so as we struggle with passages like these parables that really challenge us, especially depending on where we're coming into this parable, I thought, what if we looked at the kingdom of heaven like something different? Maybe not a vineyard in first century. What if we looked at the kingdom of heaven with something we were a little bit more familiar with? How would that play out? So I thought about the kingdom of heaven is like the program we do once a year called Stop Hunger Now or Rise Against Hunger. And how we view the success or the positives or negatives of the program are kind of based on the perspective where we enter this program. For those of you that may not be familiar with it, we package up 10,000 meals that'll be sent somewhere in the world to feed children lunches. Now there's an active part of it where we package all the different pieces and parts, and there is the perspective that we need to raise money to pay for the materials that we package. So in a sense, all of us here at St. John's have a hand in the activity, whether it's through our contributions each week, or it's through activating ourselves the day of Stop Hunger Now. And I know that it doesn't really happen that often, but there are times where people take issue with even a program that feeds 10,000 children's lunch. But what's great about this program, and it's something that I would love to be able to replicate on many different levels, is that everyone who participates in the day of this packing has a job. Whether you're 3 or you're 103, there's something that each person can do. And each person is asked to do something based on their abilities. If it's simply just carrying a bag from one place to another, or lifting heavy bags from one place to another, everyone gets to do something in this process. Everyone agrees to come out and to do one of those tasks, whatever they may be, in order to help package all these meals that can be shipped around. Now, while I think if everyone participated, they'd probably still find a way for everybody to do something, or we would make it a larger program. But those who aren't even there that day have already participated in their donations. And that's important to note because it's all the pieces coming together. And the key is that at the end of the day, whether it takes 2 hours or 4 hours or 5 or 6 hours, at the end of the day, 10,000 more school children get lunch. We've all participated in some fashion, and in the end, people are fed. That's the perspective that I think this gospel message especially, and somewhat the Old Testament, but this gospel message points out. This landowner gives everyone the minimum they need to live for another day, to work for another day. And I think it's important that we remember the bigger picture, that this is about God's grace. This is about God giving to us. I use the example of Stop Hunger Now because once we commit to the program, we trust that wherever those meals are going, they're delivered and they're given out. Now, there are always some hiccups in that, but once we agree to it and we sign a contract and we agree to pay, we don't get the control of telling Stop Hunger Now where to send those. The beautiful part about their program is they continuously communicate with somebody from the church and let them know exactly where and when and how the meals are served. I'd forgotten this earlier in the morning service, but I was having lunch with somebody this week with Samantha and a couple other clergy members, and they had done a program, and it just so happened that the one that they had attended from Stop Hunger Now had a person who was in the field on a mission trip, and they were going along and they saw that there were Stop Hunger Now boxes in this large warehouse that were about to be distributed. And they passed on the story that they were asking the children in that town, village, what was their favorite thing to eat. And I'm going to get the word wrong, but for all intents and purposes, it was some form where a child said, "I like convoy food." And no one really understood what he meant when he said convoy. So they asked him again, and he repeated himself, and they asked him to explain, and he said, "It's those meals that come in the big trucks all together, and they unload those boxes, and we get lunches from those convoy meals." We don't get to decide God's grace, and we don't get to decide where those meals go, but we trust in the fact that we've participated because the big picture is 10,000 children are fed. I think that that's the key to this passage, that God's perspective, God's grace is enough for all of us. The one thing that God asks in creating us is that we take those God-given gifts and we use them. But if we use them, and when we use them, we're doing the will of God. He only asks for everything we have. But the benefit is we receive everything God has. And I think the scales are weighted in God's favor. So as I said, we need to remember the big picture. Not one wage over another, not one person over another, but that people are being cared for, being taken care of. And if we give all we have, God's grace will be far more than we could ever ask or imagine. But the key to the passage is that it's God's perspective, not our own, that's important. And then I realized, having finished looking at the passage all week, I remembered something I noted 2 weeks ago in my sermon. I pointed out that Mother Teresa had some wise wisdom to share. Mother Teresa says, in the end, it's between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway. Amen.